You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 10th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
Cette décision est grave, lourde, mais c'est avant tout un acte de confiance. Ce n'est pas un bon résultat pour les partis qui défendent l'Europe, dont celui de la majorité présidentielle.
After a surprising European election, Emmanuel Macron provides the shock of the night by announcing the dissolution of France's parliament and fresh elections, claiming he has confidence in the French people. We'll get the latest on a risky gamble from Paris. After that, an attack on Denmark's prime minister prompts questions about security and the accessibility of world leaders. Then we turn to Brazil for a looming extradition battle with Argentina. And finally,
welcome to Apple Park. We have a huge day of announcements ahead of us.
Apple CEO Tim Cook trying to gin up excitement there. We get a preview of the Apple's Developers Conference from our tech correspondent David Phelan. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. The European Parliament elections are the world's second largest democratic exercise, with 27 countries voting at the same time over 4 days, ending on Sunday. But by the end of the evening yesterday, all anyone could really talk about was one of those 27 countries. That's because in France, after the right-wing National Rally Party had stormed to victory, President Emmanuel Macron surprised pretty much everybody by dissolving his own country's parliament and calling for national legislative elections, with the first round to be held in just 3 weeks' time. Well, joining me now from Paris is Agnès Parrier, journalist and author of Notre Dame, the Soul of France. Agnes, great to have you on the show on a busy day there, I'm sure. How did Emmanuel Macron explain his surprise decision? Let's start with that.
Well, what was interesting is that he announced he would address the nation just after the results or the exit polls at 8 p.m. Paris time. And we were kind of surprised because the president never addresses the nation after EU elections. So we were wondering whether he had something big to tell us, but we dreaded we just couldn't fathom that he would trigger the dissolution of the French Parliament quite yet. I mean, it was always going to be a strong possibility in the autumn, simply because the last 2 years have been quite difficult for his government. As you know, he's got a minority government, doesn't have a majority at the National Assembly. It's made his life and that of his government very difficult in the last 2 years, with a lot of no confidence votes, which was rejected. But it is sort of exhausting French politics, and it was assumed he would dissolve the parliament sometime before the end of the year, but certainly not now, and certainly not just before the Paris Olympic Games.
It is interesting the way you describe the last couple of years and how exhausting that has been in the French Parliament. Surely that is not going to get any easier after the results from this national legislative election are in, at least if polls are to be believed. What does he expect will change if, say, the National Rally gets even more support than it did before?
Well, perhaps he's just counting on a sort of, electric shock for the country, because it's one thing to cast a vote because you're angry, and this is really what the far right and the Le Pen vote has meant for a lot of French voters in the last 40 years. The only thing is that their numbers have been increasing steadily, but it's always been usually during the European elections or the municipal elections or the first round of the presidential election, a protest vote, an angry vote at the status quo. But now President Macron is saying, fine, I've heard you loud and clear, and this is the chance for you if you want to go all the way. Do you really want a far-right government to govern the nation? And perhaps is counting on that stark choice, existential choice, to affect the French voters and for them to think, okay, well, is anger the right feeling when one decides of the fate of the country?
So that's one aspect of this, that Emmanuel Macron is sort of calling the bluff of the French voter, if you will, by doing this. But I guess the other side or question here is the National Rally and Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, for that matter. They're two sort of leaders at the moment. What is your sense of whether what do they need to do to convince voters that, no, they are a serious party ready to govern? That's kind of what also this election, even the European election for that matter, was about, wasn't it? You were seeing now farther right parties, also in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who are governing, who are showing that they have a serious side, even if they are extreme. What does Marine Le Pen need to do to convince French voters that she can do the same thing?
Well, she's been preparing for that moment ever since she took the helm of the party 13 years ago. And she's been quite successful. Not at the presidential elections, but in local elections, certainly. So, she strikes a very different figure from her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. In many ways, she's a modern, woman. She's twice divorced. She's pro-abortion, pro-gay rights. She has kind of purged the party from all its louche and unrespectable and certainly unsavory people. At least on the surface, the last 13 years, she's been showing a front of a very, not perhaps an image of competence, but at least people who are serious, especially the last 2 years in Parliament, while the far left was resolving to throwing tantrums and insulting people at the National Assembly. Actually, all the Le Pen MPs wearing suits, looking respectable, acted in a very reasonable way. I mean, again, I'm talking about the surface, but once in power, I have no idea how they will behave. But they did prepare their moment very well. A lot of people, especially young people, who have not known Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father, and who perhaps are a little ignorant of French history, think that they are not far right. They are just, perhaps hard right, but they are asking the right questions and they don't frighten anyone. So we'll see whether they are successful. Don't forget that the legislative elections have 2 rounds. It is quite improbable that Le Pen's party will reap a majority at the National Assembly. She has for the moment 80 seats and there are in total 577. So we might see just another hung parliament and a messier one.
And just finally and quickly, before we let you go, for Emmanuel Macron, you described there sort of the changes on Le Pen's side, how she's shifting, moderating the party. Is there anything we can expect different from Emmanuel Macron in the next 3 weeks, or is he just kind of doubling down on who he is and what he represents?
Well, he will talk about Ukraine. He will talk about the incoherent and confused economic policies of Le Pen's party. or those that were debated during the EU elections, but somehow the French electorate didn't perhaps listen carefully because they didn't have a direct interest in them. But now they might listen more carefully.
Thank you very much, Agnes. I'm sure we'll have much more on the French elections in the weeks coming. That was Agnes Poirier. Now here's Vincent McAviney with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Senior EU party officials will meet today to work out groups and alliances for the next 5 years, following election results in which far-right parties made gains in France, Italy and Germany. The pro-European centre ground is by far and away the largest force in Parliament, but the political landscape surrounding it has changed as Green and pro-business liberal groups across the continent suffered defeats. They will also discuss whether to return Ursula von der Leyen to the helm of the EU's most powerful executive branch, the European Commission. Japan has tightened its already strict immigration rules to make it easier to deport asylum seekers repeatedly applying for refugee status. The new law has stirred debate around Japan's treatment of undocumented immigrants, while the country looks to attract more foreign workers to tackle its demographic decline. The US Secretary of State is embarking on another tour of the Middle East in an effort to bolster support for a ceasefire agreement in Gaza. It's Antony Blinken's 8th trip to the region since the war between Israel and Hamas began last October. During the 3-day visit, which begins in Egypt, he'll urge Arab leaders to pressure Hamas into accepting the proposed peace deal, which was unveiled last month by President Joe Biden. And French Guiana has become the first French overseas territory to welcome the Olympic torch for the first time in its history. The relay began the South American stage of its journey in the heart of the Amazon rainforest and finished in the capital city of Cayenne. In all, some 11,000 torchbearers will take part ahead of the Paris Games at the end of July. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Vincent. Now to Denmark, where the country's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, was assaulted in Copenhagen's Old Town on Friday night. The attack by a 39-year-old Polish man who was arrested is the latest in a string of assaults against European politicians of late. And though authorities do not believe this one was politically motivated, it has nevertheless raised some questions in Denmark about just how freely their politicians walk through the city and its streets without more serious security. Well, Monocle's correspondent based in Copenhagen, Michael Booth, joins us now. Michael, let's start with just what happened on Friday.
Hello, good afternoon. Yeah, apparently Mette Frederiksen was walking through Kultorvet, which is one of the pedestrian areas in central Copenhagen, quite close to where she has an apartment. And to be honest, I don't think it was particularly savage or intended attack. Apparently a man kind of shoulder barged her or pushed her. She fell to the ground, suffered mild whiplash, apparently, went to hospital for a couple of hours. And the man, as you say, 39-year-old Polish man, turned out to be both high and drunk. But until we found out about this, it took about a day, I think, before the news of who he was, and that we discovered it was really an unpremeditated, kind of almost accidental attack. Of course, social media in Denmark went into meltdown about this. It was. We all held our breath. Was this a politically motivated attack? If so, as you say, will it affect the general kind of openness with which leading politicians go about their lives in Denmark, which is something the Danes really treasure, that kind of open, transparent, it's very easy to get in touch with politicians here. Was that in danger? The last time anything like this happened in Denmark was back in 2003 when the then Prime Minister, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, someone threw red paint over him as a protest against the Iraq war. So it's been more than 20 years since anything like this happened. And I can remember the first time I went to Copenhagen 25 years ago, seeing the then Prime Minister, Poul Nyrup Rasmussen, walking around in the centre of Copenhagen about 200 metres from where Mette Frederiksen was in October, and no one was paying him any attention whatsoever. And I found this totally remarkable. And I said to my then Danish girlfriend, now my wife, what's going on? Isn't that the Prime Minister? And she was like, yeah, it's no biggie. And then as I was preparing to come on and talk to you, I suddenly realised I've shared a dance floor with Mette Frederiksen. Every Dane it can be connected by one or two connections to the Prime Minister or the ex-Prime Minister. It's such a small country that they cherish this kind of openness. And everyone held their breath over the weekend.
Well, it is extraordinary the way you describe that openness of just seeing Danish prime ministers in the streets of Copenhagen, sharing darts games with them. I mean, what do you get the sense then of how this will really change? Do the Danish want this to change? Has Mette Frederiksen herself said anything about whether this might change as a result of this attack?
No, she hasn't. And I don't expect it to change anything. There were terrible, cynical comments along the lines of, obviously we had an EU election yesterday in Denmark, and Mette Frederiksen ceased her campaigning on the Saturday because she said on a Facebook post that she wanted to spend some quiet time with her family recovering. She didn't get a sympathy vote, it has to be said. The vote for her party, the Social Democrats, was down by about 15-16%. But generally, we're about to actually have what's called Folkemødet, which is a kind of, the Glastonbury festival of politics here in Denmark. It takes place, I think, next week on the island of Bornholm, and that's known for all of the politicians go there. You can walk up to the Prime Minister, you can walk up to the leaders of the political parties and chat with them. I recently became a Danish citizen, and as part of the celebrations of that, they open up the Danish Parliament, literally open it up to all of the people who just got a passport, and you can wander around and all the leaders of the parties are there, and you can just go up to them and talk to them. It's really it's difficult to imagine that being that changing in the future.
Well, and just finally then, Michael, I mean, you describe how you feel about this yourself, also having just become a Danish citizen. Have you had conversations over the weekend with other Danes? I mean, is this something that they kind of take for granted? Do they interact with their leaders and use these opportunities that they have? And is it something that they would miss if it was lost?
Absolutely. The conversations I've had with Danes, nearly all of them went along these lines. Number one, if this really is what we think happened, a politically motivated attack, it's a terrible thing. It's terrible that anyone would be attacked like this, or anyone should be harmed in public in Denmark. They cherish the safety and freedom in Denmark, generally, for all citizens. The next part of the sentence was, I really don't like Mette Frederiksen. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but, we don't like her. And she is. I think there's a special relationship right now with the Prime Minister of this country that's not going so well. And part of that is to do actually with her autocratic approach and her slightly she claims to be of the people, but she has a very kind of almost dictatorial style, which is rubbing the Danes up the wrong way at the moment. So all of that, it was in the mix here in this story, Chris.
Michael Booth, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. To Brazil now, where at the start of last year, the country faced some pretty extraordinary riots in the aftermath of Jair Bolsonaro's loss and the victory of Lula da Silva in presidential elections. Authorities have since been looking to punish any and all who were involved, and the investigation has now taken them to Argentina. Brazil is requesting the extradition of some 60 plotters who fled to Argentina to escape punishment. Well, Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, joins us now in studio for more. Good afternoon, Faye.
Good afternoon, Chris.
So, let's start with this. What has happened to the Brazilian rioters of last year to date, until now?
I have to say, although, the rioters on the 8th of January, when they invaded Congress and other public buildings, they were unchallenged on the day. But I have to say, the reaction post-mortem was very swift. And there's been condemnation from all political parties, including the right-wing parties as well. So I think that was quite remarkable. And I was reading a story, Chris, the difference between the invasion in the capital and in Brazil. Only 6% of Brazilians said that they approved this invasion, while in the US the number was higher, it was 22%.
And it's grown since again.
Exactly, which is very weird. So there's been swift reaction. Many of them have been arrested, and this the topic you're talking about these Brazilians in Argentina was part of a new operation by the federal police in Brazil, which started last Thursday. They are looking for 208 of people who are currently fugitives, and they found out that apparently 60 of them are in Argentina indeed.
So what happens then now? What can you tell us about this extradition request and how far that kind of goes?
It is early days. And some people are saying that those 60 people, they went to Argentina after December when Javier Milei won the presidency. So it's someone perhaps that is more to their liking if they are supporters of Bolsonaro. But I have to say, the security minister of Argentina, Patricia Bullrich, she said that she doesn't know where are those Brazilians, and there haven't been an official, actually, extradition request from the government. This could happen this week. It's already, as we say, it's being reported in the press already. So I think they're waiting to see. And of course, there's the controversy. Will Milei accept the request or not? I have a feeling that he will probably do, but he's a very unpredictable character, so I don't want to make any promises here.
Well, he is an unpredictable character, and he is also, frankly, an ally, might one say, of Jair Bolsonaro. How do you expect that to impact this? He's an ally of Bolsonaro. He is, though, the leader of his country, who also has to therefore cooperate with President Lula. So what do you expect how do you expect that to go?
It's going to be tough. And I think Brazil and Argentina, they are very important allies economically. So, for example, Brazil is Argentina's main trading partner, and they are a big market for us Brazilians as well. So you have to be very careful how you play around with that. And from what I've been reading in the Brazilian press, the relationship between Jair Bolsonaro and Argentina's former president, Alberto Fernandes, managed to be even worse than the current relationship between Milei and Lula. I don't think they are in friendly terms. I don't think they will have many bilateral meetings, but their ministers, they do talk to each other. There are a lot of diplomatic meetings. I think the foreign minister from Argentina was in São Paulo recently talking to a few business people in the country. So it is a relationship that needs to be cherished. But politically, they are completely on the opposite spectrum when it comes to policies, both Milei and Lula.
In other sense, are you saying sort of that while they have their political differences, there is still recognition that these two countries need each other? Is that part of what this is?
Yes, and in April this year, Milei sent a letter to Lula saying, that he wants the countries to have normal relationships because, Brazil is a very important ally of Argentina. So there's some trying here, but and as I said, Milei is unpredictable, but he's got to be careful because he did say anti-China statements as well, and China is another big trading partner of Argentina. So it's funny that he kind of have a bad relationship. I know he's a big fan of the US, but he can't have a bad relationship with China and Brazil. Otherwise, the country, honestly, their economy is already very much in trouble. He simply cannot do that. And I think his cabinet of ministers are definitely looking into that.
And just finally, to go back to Brazil, if you will, and the rioters and where this has started, seeking the potential extradition of 60 of them, has the Brazilian way of looking at this evolved at all? You said that only 6% or so supported that initial storming of the Capitol. Has that changed over time? Have you seen, kind of like, as you mentioned in the US, we've seen this sort of almost rewriting of the history of January 6th. Has that happened at all in Brazil?
It didn't. It really didn't. And listen, Bolsonaro, I think, is still an important character, and the right is strong in Brazil. They have the majority in Congress, not necessarily Bolsonaro, but the center-right and right-wing parties. But the invasion of Congress affected Brazilians. I've been thinking, this is just perhaps my opinion, we had a military dictatorship. And I do think that even if you're a Bolsonaro supporter, when you see someone invading Congress, I think, it brought bad memories to Brazilians in a way. So I do think there's a big difference. There's no kind of rewriting of history. And as I said, only 6% of Brazilians look back favorably to the supporters. And listen, Bolsonaro has like 30% of support. So it's very much, in that sense, it's been good for Brazilian democracy in that sense.
It's been a healthy response.
Healthy response, exactly.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's briefing. Today marks the start of Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference. Once considered a pioneering conference of the tech world, it has been somewhat more muted in recent years, struggling to rise above the fray of competition. Apple is trying to create some buzz this year by announcing the adoption of generative AI, reportedly in partnership with ChatGPT creators OpenAI. But with other companies well ahead in their AI development, the question here too is what exactly Apple can offer the space. Well, to help us answer that question and many more, Monocle's technology correspondent David Phelan joins me now on the line. David, great to have you back on the show. What is the mood at Apple ahead of this conference, first of all? Is it different this year?
Every year they say it's going to be the greatest ever, but there really is a buzz this time that this could be something different. Last year we saw the announcement of the big thing was the augmented reality headset, Apple Vision Pro. But this year, it's all going to be about software, and it's going to be, as you say, about generative AI. Apple has slipped behind, I think it's fair to say, other brands, not least because of its obsession with privacy. It wants everything to be done on device if it can be, because that's the most secure way of doing things. It may have to modify that, but that's one of the reasons that it's taken so long to catch up with AI features. But it looks like today at 6 p.m. UK, 10 a.m. Pacific, when the keynote kicks off, definitely they're going to call it Apple Apple Intelligence instead of artificial intelligence, but that is going to be the big key part of the keynote.
And, describe for us a little bit, David, where you feel like the buzz then comes from. Is it merely the fact that Apple is kind of stepping into this space, even though, as you say, they're kind of late to the game here? So what makes them optimistic about this moment? Are they going to do something different with AI than the other companies already in it?
I think that's the aim. Apple's never worried about not being the first. It always says, don't do it first, do it right. And they will have learned from what other companies have seen. And in fact, just a few months ago, I talked to the CEO, Tim Cook, who again was stressing that more important than anything was privacy, which they describe as a fundamental human right. That if you are sending so much personal data to the cloud, which you need to do with advanced generative AI features, then you risk limiting security. They're saying that everything, I think they're going to say, is going to be on very secure Apple servers when it does have to be sent to the cloud, but they will use iPhones like the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max, which have very powerful processors, to do as much on device as they can. But they'll certainly be going down the same routes as other brands, so that Siri, the voice assistant, will be enhanced so that it can do a lot more. You can control your phone or your Mac or your iPad much more with your voice. You'll be able to edit photos with your voice. You'll be able to do lots of things that currently some companies can do. You can summarize web pages, for example, is what I think summarization is going to come up a lot in this keynote. It's all aimed to be useful rather than the kind of whiz-bang extraordinary things like video creation that some generative AI companies are focusing on.
And just to follow up on that, David, I'm just curious, is there any, I suppose, skepticism of that at all? Has Apple waited long enough, in other words, to really do exactly as you described, their tradition of kind of doing things right? AI, on the one hand, they're late to the game. On the other hand, it is still pretty early days. Have they really figured things out?
Well, you're exactly right. Yeah, I think, yes, at the same time as them feeling left behind, the guardrails are still being put in place around generative AI. And I think Apple is very cautious about many things, and this is certainly one of them. They are going to make sure that everything is very much controlled so that the dangers or perceived dangers of generative AI can't get through. But I think that it's going to be a very busy keynote, and they're going to be hammering away at every new feature, some of which other companies will already have, but they will stress that doing it the Apple way is safer for everybody.
And just finally, David, I mean, are there other announcements that you are expecting that you're excited about from this developers conference, or is it all going to be more about kind of all the different applications of AI to the various Apple products that exist?
I think there's going to be non-AI features as well. I think there's going to be a new passwords app. There's never been an Apple-made passwords app to save passwords securely. Voice Notes is going to have transcription. I'm really looking forward to that. It means I won't have to transcribe endless interviews anymore. And I think we'll see the international release date announced for the Apple Vision Pro coming to China, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and a couple of other places.
So still a busy conference ahead. Thank you very much. That was David Phelan, and that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAviney. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.